Welcome to Haxby Shed. This morning I'm round at my son's to help him change some taps on this wash basin in the bathroom. Now, changing taps can be a really easy job, or it can be really quite tricky. Now, I should say before we get into this, I'm not a plumber. This is just DIY. So, I'll explain what I'm doing. I'm not teaching, but it might be useful to you. So when I say taps, I mean these things. So we've got some replacements ready to go. Now, the first thing to think about is turning the water off. Now, if you're lucky, on the supply to your sink, under your taps, you'll find ball valves that look like this. If you've got those, just turn that quarter of a turn and you'll isolate the water from the tap. If that screw is across that way, it's turned off. If it's in line, it's turned on. You might have flexible pipes that look like this, and those flexible pipes might have one of those on the end. But either way, that's the easiest way of turning the water off. Now, if you don't have anything like that on the pipes leading up to the taps, then you've got to ask yourself the question, have you got water tanks or not? If your house still has a hot tank and a cold tank, you're going to have to isolate those. Now, normally the isolation valves are in the airing cupboard, but not always, and it can be tricky because they can be seized up. Now, if you've got that situation, you're going to have to drain those tanks, and you'd have to turn the water off as it comes into the house and then drain them down, and then you can work on the taps. Now, if you don't have tanks, and I suppose these days most houses in the UK have got rid of the old tanks, then if you can't isolate at the sink, then you just turn the main supply off to your house. Now, that's normally under the sink, or it's often under the sink, but I've seen it in many different places. Sometimes the water pipe comes up into the house where your main toilet waste pipe goes down, but I've seen it behind cookers, particularly where it's come into the kitchen, but then the kitchen's been relayed out in a different way, and the stop taps can end up in cupboards and all sorts of places. But that's the thing to do. If you don't have the tanks, you can just isolate the water there, and once it's turned off, you'll just need to drain down these taps because you'll still have water in the pipe. So if you're upstairs and if we've turned the water off, we can turn a tap on downstairs, open this, and the water will drain away. So it will take the water out of these pipes. And so on. You can step through that to isolate these before you start work on them. So let's say you've turned the water off, and ideally you've drained a little bit of water out of the pipe. So the next thing to think about, here's your replacement tap. Will it go straight on as a one-for-one replacement? Well, that depends. This length here isn't necessarily standard, and it may be that as you size these up against your existing taps, this is a bit longer or a bit shorter. So something's got to move for you to be able to fit them. If you've got this sort of flexible pipe already feeding your sink, or if you've got plastic pipes, well, there's plenty of movement in both of those. But if you've got copper pipes coming up to your old taps, then it might be you've got to push them down into the floor a little bit or pull them up a bit, if there's some give there. If there's no give, then you could fit these, but you'd have to shorten your existing pipe to do it. Or there may be other ways, but these are the things you've got to think through as you're doing the job. It's the things that can make the difference between something that's quite simple and something that's quite complicated. And another thing is, what's the end of your tap like? Now, quite often with copper pipe fittings, you get this kind of union. I may have to give you another shot of this because that might not be in focus. But if you can see it there, there's a spigot on the end, and then you have a fibre washer. This is an old fibre washer. We could do with a new one. But that fibre washer just sits on the spigot there, and then that just screws onto the bottom of your tap like that. Okay? But an alternative, when you've got these kind of fittings, is there's actually a rubber washer in there. Now the thing about those is not to over tighten them. If you do, you'll slice through that washer and it will leak. So the trick is to just get them finger tight and a little bit more, that's all. Okay, so the next thing is actually to turn the water off and get these taps off. Now the taps, typically they have a plastic or a brass big nut here, and particularly on the cold tap those can seize and can be really difficult to get off, and also it can be difficult to get up under the basin. Now to get in you can use something like a basin spanner. Okay, and as you might expect that goes on there. It's quite a loose fitting, but it needs to be because you might come in at all sorts of funny angles. You can put a wrench on this and turn it like that. Now as you do that, if it's seized, it's inevitable, the tap's going to spin and it'll just go round and round. So it's helpful to have my son here who can hold this tap if that's the case. Now just then I talked about shortening the pipes, and to do that you'd use a tool like this, a pipe cutter. And as you turn this wheel here, it advances these rollers which push the pipe up hard against the cutter knife. Now that's a sort of medium-sized one, that's a small one, and that's very useful for tight spaces. And as it cuts the pipe, you simply turn it, tighten it, turn it, tighten it. Okay, I'll leave it there, but it's cutting its way around this pipe, and when it cuts through altogether it will finish with a deburred edge. So that's quite rough. I've probably cut it with a hacksaw at some point. Actually I will go all the way if I can do it quickly. This is real-time TV, folks, and you can see it's actually curved the edge of that, so there's no sharp edge on it, and that's how easy it is. So they're very useful. Just to mention another useful tool, this long wrench with a spring-loaded jaw, and that's quite useful for the smaller nuts like that. You can get quite a way up under a basin with this. Okay, so there's the union that we need to remove, and then above that we've got the big nut that holds the tap onto the sink. There's a bit of corrosion there, but it's not too bad. That's the cold side. Well, I think we're in luck because this has cracked off quite easily. Just to say, when you're using tools like this, just be careful because it's so easy to break your basin, or even just a knock. If you're not paying attention, you probably just smash that. I'm sure it's been done many, many times. That's free now. Oh, we're in luck today. That's coming off quite easily. Bit awkward to get your fingers in sometimes. Well, we really are in luck today. Look, there's the old tap, there's the new tap, and they are the same length. And when I look at the ends, they're pretty much the same. So this could be a quick job, and in fact, on the new taps, these nuts are brass, and on the old taps, they were plastic. Which, I'm not saying the new taps are better quality, I'm just saying it is better. You can get it much tighter with a brass nut like that. But again, don't over tighten it because of course you might crack your bowl. Well, that's one fitted already. Took us about 10 minutes, no more. And my son's just cleaning up the base for the other. The rubber washer goes there. And the taps that we took off, there was no rubber washer. So I think whoever fitted them used silicone. But it meant that the taps could kind of turn quite easily. This part could turn quite easily. Second one going on now. I'll have to come and hold it, won't I, while you tighten it?
Yeah.
Go on then. These don't have to be very tight, you know, it's just tightening by hand really. And it needs needs to be tightened from underneath. If you try turning this tap to tighten it, it just puckers the washer up and the washer will spin off to one side.
There we go.
And of course, once you've done this, it's pretty tight there, but then when you connect the copper pipe, that also makes it a lot stiffer. And that's actually a good point, because I'll show you if you give me a second. If you use these sort of pipes on a sink which is not rigid, say you've taken off the taps from a stainless steel sink, but it's quite a thin sink, well, actually the copper pipes provide a lot of rigidity to the tap. But if you cut them short and you put one of these on, you've lost all that rigidity, which was helping to support the tap. So you go from having a fairly rigid tap on a thin stainless steel sink to something that's kind of waving about all over the place, particularly if it's one of those big taps. So that's, you know, something to bear in mind. There is some advantages to having the copper pipes, just to provide that rigidity, even though they're harder to work with, of course. So he's just connecting the pipe onto the bottom of the tap. Here's an important tip. Make sure the hot and the cold are on the right side, because when I started I put this near one on, and without thinking about it I was putting the tap on that was labelled hot. Now obviously you can take the tops off and you can swap them over, it's not a problem, but it's just a lot better if you get hot and cold on the right side to start with. Moment of truth, we've turned the water on, he just needs to check it's not leaking. Just try the taps. You might have air bubbles coming out, of course, because we drained some of the water off a bit. So we're just going to leave that a little while and just make sure that it doesn't start to drip after sort of 10 minutes or so. But otherwise, that job's finished. So how long have we been doing this?
45 minutes, half an hour.
45 minutes? No, not half an hour. About 45 minutes to an hour. So if it goes smoothly, then an hour should see it done without any trouble. Anyway, I hope that was useful to you. Thanks for watching. Hacks be shared.